So now we're into the part of the agenda where we want even more engagement and interaction from everybody in the room here and also the folks online as well. A number of us were working fairly late last night to pull together all the output from the case studies from yesterday and the discussion and the questions and everything. And so I wanted to first of all reassure you that all your input is being captured because we don't have time to cover everything. We don't have time to answer all the questions, unfortunately, in the session today. But nonetheless, we are capturing that because that is very valuable. And we will be talking later about how to use this and what your expectations are going forward from here in terms of how we should use this information and take things forward. Just to introduce you and give you a sense, this slide, as I mentioned, this slide presentation actually has about 90 slides in it, but we're not going to go over those. I want to reassure you, but it does contain a summary of all the discussion topics that the teams raised yesterday, grouped into a number of different themes that seem to have emerged. We've done the same thing with all the best practice recommendations from the slide presentations. Again, we've taken those out and grouped those all together to give us a sense of, if you like, where the center of gravity is on the major topics and themes that we'd identified that are listed in the agenda. With that, and taking the input from the web questions that Nigel and Catherine have been capturing, as well as all the questions from the floor, we've ended up with a list of something like 8 or 9 topics that you can see here. I doubt very much whether we're going to have time to cover all of those in the amount of detail that we'd like to in the next 2 hours, but we're going to give it our best shot. And we've got a team of myself, Evdokia, Lina to help steer that discussion. We've got our panelists, the presenters from yesterday's case studies to provide their expertise and experience as well to reflect further on any of the questions. So hopefully that will give us a good basis to take the discussion forward in the next 2 hours. The first thing I think we want to do is to ask you, the audience, whether you see additional major issues that we've not got on this list that we think we need to try and cover, either in the discussion today or taking it forward that we need to think about. So perhaps that's the first area that we'd like to capture. Are the kinds of topics, the ones that came up yesterday, the themes that we have on the slide here, are there additional areas that are really big that we need to cover and that we need to take forward? I can see Sean's got a suggestion. Sean?
I don't know whether this might come under item 3, use of models, but one thing that seems to be very important with QBD is design of experiments. And Q8, Q9, Q10, 11 do not talk about design of experiments, although refers to design of experiments. And there are certain ways in which you can have a good design of experiments and not so good. And for example, one thing that perhaps should be done is an estimate of repeatability, because good science is repeatable. And I was wondering whether this could be an item for consideration.
I think that's a good suggestion. Let's take your suggestion, and maybe it doesn't quite fit necessarily entirely under use of models, but there seems to be an element of overlap, if we put it that way. And when we come to that topic, let's capture that thought and bring that up. So that's a good suggestion, Sean. Thank you. Any other suggestions? I can see a few other hands. Dieter, perhaps first.
Dieter Friedl, Bayer. When I attended a QBD workshop here at the EMA in 2006, roundabout, and it was the first steps to go to the QBD approach. One of the main topics at that time was the PAT, online, inline, at-line control. Most focus was on this. And when I see the list and I hear the case studies yesterday, PAT has not such a central role currently for the QBD approach. Maybe we can discuss also on that.
I'm sorry to disagree. Out of the 4 presentations we had yesterday, the 2 case studies were process-analytical technology. So I'm not sure why you're saying that we didn't discuss that. It was 30% of the presentations.
And that's not what I quite heard Dieter said. I think he felt that it's still a sufficiently important topic, and there may be issues that it's not on the list that's on the slide here. But
So based on the presentations yesterday that they had process-analytical technology, under each of these topics, we have the corresponding issues related to process-analytical technology, like modeling, like how you support it with design space and so on. So we captured that as a part of it.
What I wanted to say is, when at that time, QBD was defined as something to use, you have to use some inline, inline techniques, and otherwise it's not real QBD. And now we are more approached with the QBD to have it more as a systematic development approach. This was what I wanted to say. And what is missing here as a keyword is PAT.
I would like to support what Dora said, and actually, Atas Hussain, I would want to claim what he said long time ago. He said PAT is not about process analyzers and putting a lot of analyzers in the processes. You need to understand the process and then use it accordingly. And we have given examples of NIR and how it could be used in a PAT context. Maybe during the discussion, you can say a lot of PAT-related topics are addressed in the points, but PAT is not about it's not about the analytics anymore. It's how can these analytics be used to increase our understanding about the process and better control it.
So I think the topic will come up, Dieter, and we'll capture it anyway. I think if I can ask Evdokia and Lina just to make a note of these suggestions from the audience so that we make sure that we cover them. Because again, even if we don't get time to cover them today, we can look at them later. So I think that's I saw a number of other hands raised. Another one there?
Yes. I'm Inge Terrein from Janssen Pharmaceutica. In the number of discussion topics, I'm not 100% sure if we also cover the global perspective. Is QBD accepted in every country? Where is it voluntary? Where is it mandatory? And are there exceptions? Under 5, life cycle management, certainly want to come back on the interesting discussion of variations in Europe and the level of flexibility for future changes.
Sure. So the global discussion we are going to touch on later, obviously, that's on the agenda. And the variations piece, we've asked Keith, and we will be talking about, Keith's got a few slides that he will show us immediately after this topic. So we'll cover that one as well. So thank you for that. Other suggestions, yes?
Diana van Riet, Medicines Evaluation Board. I would like to explore on the scope of the method and any false positives and any false negatives in view of the presentations raised yesterday. What do you call an out of trend? What do you call an out of specification? And how do you, at the one point, can say a method is like fully developed, you got a design space, and then at the same time say that some parameters were not taken into consideration and afterwards you still made to modify the design space, because you could say then that parameter was apparently outside the scope of the model. And I think it would provide further clarification if we clearly say this is a model, this is its scope, and if parameters like a batch scale or a different supplier of raw material have not been taken into consideration when this model was being built, how you're going to then proceed afterwards if you would enter something into the model which have these different parameters.
So if I can suggest that you hold that thought, and maybe when we get to the use of models discussion, we can either include it in there, and perhaps also the dossier quality system interactions. I think there's elements of what you were saying that might be covered there as well. That's okay. Other suggestions? One at the back, Manish?
So I don't think it needs to be explicitly stated here, but implicit is the specifications, more importantly, the harmonization of specifications, because it clearly impacts the viability of design space, the breadth of control strategy, etc.
Okay. So again, there's a sort of an international dimension
Right.
there. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yeah, we
That's
have
good.
this. We have it.
We have it covered.
Yeah, that's good. I can see some nods there. Other suggestions? One at the back there.
Hi, David Vaslin from UCB. It's sort of between control strategy and life cycle management, but I didn't hear too much about process validation and what role is there for process validation in the new QBD paradigm?
Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion. We talked last night and recognised that we hadn't really talked about that. So yeah, perhaps we can cover it either in those, or certainly we'll capture that as a topic to think about. Good. Other suggestions? This is a laundry list that's getting longer and longer, isn't it?
Graham,
Yes, Frank.
one thing that I think we should raise again, and I think it was a point made by our colleague from Roche Genentech, of maybe a lot of the presentations that we gave yesterday were our first company's stabs into this area. And we learned a hell of a lot through that. We put a lot of sort of storyline that maybe sort of confused as well as helped. And our future submissions will be more like enhanced traditional submissions. So, but they will have a lot of understanding and knowledge in it. They just won't have kind of sort of breadth of development story, but more in a sort of considered fashion. I think it's important to remember that context, because I think it goes to a point John Louis made yesterday about maybe a changing nature in some of the dossiers that are coming forward.
No, that's right. And I think that's one of the challenges that the steering committee faces in terms of trying to take all the material, the information that we've had, and translate that into something that actually is helpful to everybody moving forward. If we give you all the raw data, so to speak, then I think that will just create even more confusion potentially. So that is a challenge that we face, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. There were a lot of hands raised. I'm not sure if I've seen everybody. So are there other suggestions, or are we running out of steam? One at the back there, thank you.
Yes, I'm Alanon from Lille in France. One of the topics that I have not seen and not discussed a lot during those 2 days is the scale-up. What do we do at lab scales? What do we do at the industrial scale, commercial scale?
So Lina is very keen on that topic, and I think we're going to
It is
cover that one
included,
in the
yes,
discussion.
it is
So
included.
very good suggestion. We've got it covered. Thank you. Other suggestions? Okay, well that was very helpful. If I can just ask if Nigel and Catherine, if there are anything that's come in over the web, if they can wave at me through the window, perhaps. No. So nothing additional from people online. So okay, so we've got a pretty good list of topics there. Lina and Evdokia have captured some of the additional suggestions, and we'll try and include some of those suggestions in either in these topics, or we'll have to take them offline later. But at this point, I think what might be useful is, before we get into the major discussions, if I can ask Keith Pugh to come and tell us a little bit more about the topic that was raised around variations yesterday, then that may be helpful, and we can kind of set the scene on that one and then move into the other discussions. So thank you, Keith.
Thank you, Graham. Yeah, obviously the discussions yesterday and today have highlighted the importance of life cycle change management, and just thought it'd be useful to highlight what the current European system is in terms of change management, be it relation to design space or sort of QBD submissions. So I've prepared a sort of a small number of slides just to put this into perspective. This is focused obviously on the European. We've already heard the global challenges regarding this, and there are obviously different systems in different regions and countries across the world. So in terms of Europe, we have a legislation, which is a regulation, and in terms of I think the key part of that underpins the regulation is that there is a very detailed classification guideline. I guess a lot of you may well be very familiar with the contents of the classification guideline, but really in terms of management of change, that is the key document in terms of how specific changes should be managed. The structure of the classification is actually follows a risk-based approach, and I'll highlight that in the next slide. But the other thing which has also been mentioned is the concept of a post-approval change management protocol. This was introduced during January 2010, so it's fairly recent development in Europe. But essentially, it's a two-phase approach where companies can justify downgrading a change according to the classification guideline based on sort of their understanding, knowledge of a product. No restrictions in terms of the nature of the change, but we acknowledge that this type of thing could be applied, actively applied in the area of QBD submissions if required. No restrictions in terms of whether this can apply to chemical or biopharmaceutical products. But the thing to note is that in terms of downgrading for biopharmaceutical products, the lowest level that can be achieved is a type 1b variation. So in terms of the risk-based structure of the variation system and the classification guideline, obviously what companies are interested in, those changes which don't require any prior approval prior to implementation. On the right-hand side of the graph on the slide, you have type 1b, type 2 extension applications, which are all different types of applications, but all require prior approval before a change can be implemented. On the left side of the slide, you have design space, and I think it's come across fairly clear that any changes within an approved design space doesn't require a variation and not require prior approval. And I suppose the area which is most interesting to industry is the type 1A change, which is a do and tell procedure where companies can actually implement the change prior to notification to the authorities. And I think this is the area where possibly some further development could be sort of achieved in the area of QBD submissions. I think the discussions yesterday focused on design space and what makes up a design space, and clearly due to the requirement for a process description of a sort of sufficient level of detail to be presented in a marketing authorization, that the design space would include elements of critical process parameters and also non-critical process parameters. It's recognized that design spaces are normally developed on the basis of the critical process parameters, and consequently that's the sort of most important content of a design space. In terms of sort of future management of changes, I just thought I should flag this up. This is the sort of the appropriate change code for the introduction of a design space or extension of a design space. So this doesn't particularly apply to a change, and in terms of an extension, you're looking at sort of relaxation, widening limits, and I would say in relation to critical process parameters, not non-critical process parameters. So in terms of how these could possibly be managed in relation to design space, obviously the process description is a regulatory commitment. The level of information there will cover the critical and non-critical process parameters, as we've already heard. I think in all of this, how a design space is actually presented in a dossier in respect of critical process parameters and non-critical process parameters is very important. And in terms of interpreting the type 2 variation, which is obviously the highest classification of a variation, if we look at an extension, a possible interpretation, and I would say that this is my interpretation of this, is that this should only be applicable to widening of critical process parameters. So that would, this needs sort of further discussion within Europe, but certainly that would be my interpretation of that, and then managing changes to non-critical process parameters could be handled differently, and I suppose in a lot of cases, according to the classification, possibly as type 1A variations, which would enable companies to implement the change prior to sort of a notification to competent authorities. Obviously, for this to sort of work, it needs to be transparently presented in the dossier so that the critical and non-critical process parameters are clearly differentiated in the process description. And there are obviously various ways of doing this in the dossier. And I think one of the examples yesterday, the tables presented, one was for critical process parameters and one was for non-critical process parameters. So clearly that can be achieved. The other thing is obviously the post-approval change management protocol can be used in all situations. So you present what you want to achieve, how you go about it, and propose a sort of a downgrading of a change. And I guess ideally for industry it would be a type 1A notification. That would be presented in the initial marketing authorization or by variation. But certainly that is an important opportunity for downgrading, which I think you as companies should sort of actively consider. Just come back to a slide Stefan presented this morning, where I just want to clarify for people where that actually came from. The current variation classification guideline dates back to August 2003. And as part of the elaboration of that guideline, there was a consultation document which went out, I think it was May, June 2012. And that proposal was included in that consultation document. That did not get accepted. I should point out that the guideline is a Commission document. In response to the consultation, the Commission deemed that it wasn't appropriate to keep that in there. But for, I think, just to reassure you, that reflects our sort of thinking around QBD and design space, that where a lot of effort has gone into the development and understanding of a product and a process, that the management of changes around that should sort of reflect that understanding, and that in the vast majority of these situations they should be manageable as type 1A notifications. So that was our thinking, and that's what went out in the consultation, but unfortunately that didn't get included in the current classification guideline. That said, there's obviously an opportunity to still sort of try and work on this to make sure that you know, this is sort of recognized moving forward, and that, I suppose, life cycle management elements shouldn't be a barrier to sort of QBD design space development. That's all I wanted to sort of say. Hopefully that clarifies the situation in Europe, and obviously there may be questions later on. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that, Keith. I'm sure we'll come back to that when we get to discuss the life cycle management, and there may be further questions. I'm not sure we necessarily want to take these topics in this particular order. So as I'm standing up here, and as I'm outnumbered, I was thinking I probably ought to do ladies first, but there's two of them and one of me. So I'm going to claim prerogative here, and since I'm up here, I'm going to pick one of the ones that we broke up into groups, and the group I was in worked on. So if I can move forward, what was very interesting in the discussions yesterday and in the materials provided by the case study team was how frequently the development story and the presentation of information in submissions came up over and over and over again. I think every case study team referred to it. So I'm going to suggest we start there, and I'm going to propose some rules of the game for the next hour and a half or whatever it is. we've had a lot of discussion about what the issues are. What we need to do now is to move forward with proposals for solutions or ways forward. Because we can talk over and over again about what the issues are, but that doesn't get us anywhere. We need solutions. So that's what the purpose of this discussion is. It's about suggestions from you, the audience, for things that we need to do as an industry to move forward and to help resolve some of these issues that we looked at in some detail yesterday, and to move us forward. So that's what we're interested in getting from you now. We want proposals for solutions, proposals for way forward, okay? And you've seen how Keith has presented some of that already. They're thinking about the variations, guidelines, some issues, but some ways forward. George, I think you want to say something.
A suggestion from industry and regulators will be very welcome.
I was using industry in the broadest term of including all of us that work to provide medicines to patients. So, yes, but you're absolutely right. Thank you, George, for that clarification.
Graham, just for on the procedure, there are 8 topics and we have 90 minutes almost, and knowing what the topics that they came up on the design space and the models, even just explaining the concepts may take 10 minutes per topic. So maybe I think we should try to keep it within 10 minutes per topic.
Yeah, that's the job Lina, Evdokia and I have, is to try and somehow manage the time. We're not necessarily going to allocate the same time to everything, and we are going to have to manage that. So some people are going to be disappointed, and I'm sure it's going to include some of us as well, but we'll see how we get on. So anyway, those are the game rules. You see, we'll see how it goes. We're looking for input. We won't get through everything, but I'm sure what we want to do is to capture suggestions and proposals to help us move forward and address some of these issues, okay? So as I said, let's move forward. Since I'm up here and standing here, I'm going to move forward to this one. As I said, this was a topic that came up a lot yesterday. All the case studies discussed aspects of telling the story, presenting the information in the dossier. To start the discussion, when we were considering this last night, we thought about the CTD format and the guidance there is around that, and particularly around these enhanced developed submissions that we talked about yesterday. The flow of the presentation, I kind of joke that the CTD is the only book that I read where you start at chapter 3 and you go back to chapter 1, then you go to chapter 7 to try and understand the story of the development. So it's not that easy to read, I don't think. Where do you put things like the design space, the control strategy, quality risk management in the dossier? How do we think about what are the compliance commitments, the registered details that we in industry need to ensure that we comply with from a legal perspective as compared to the supportive information? How do we differentiate those in the dossier? So really, that's some thoughts about that. But what are the suggestions from the audience? Is the CTD format an issue? How adequate is it? What are the suggestions? Should we be thinking about improving this, changing this, clarifying where we put information? What are your thoughts about helping us tell the story and presenting information in submissions? Yes, Nana.
Well, first of all, and it has been said before, but I will say it again, it's very important that you try to give us the story, that you try to remember that although the issue that you have been worked with for many, many years are deeply into that topic, it might be different for other companies and other way in the world, how you have used the tools. So therefore, it's important to give the message and give the story, give the introduction to your quality by design approach. Although you are using ICH wording and accepted concepts, you still have to put it into perspective. And my suggestion is that you use a quality overall summary to kind of illustrate what is the overall perspective, a map of your quality by design development. It might look very much like ICH, that you start with QTTP and so on and so forth, but still put it into there. Maybe you will make references to where in the dossier further information is found on various points.
Okay, so thank you.
One way of doing it.
That's one suggestion, use the quality overall summary. Other suggestions, what other things could we do? What other things should we be thinking about? Stefan.
I found this idea yesterday quite nice, but our colleagues from Norway, they proposed this table where we have addressed the quality by design issues, and you have this cross-references to the corresponding sections. This was a great idea, I guess. This could be put into this section. This would be a great.
So the use of summary tables, particularly around control strategy, was a proposal that was suggested as a possible best practice, and we saw a number of different examples. So that's being reinforced by Stefan. Other ideas? Yes.
I can, Tom Hansen from Vertex. I can just explain to you what we have done at Vertex in our quality by design submissions and see what people think. Generally, we will put the entire development history into the development sections, S26 and P23. But then the actual process descriptions, whatever those are very brief, and at least in some of our iterations have not even put the non-critical process steps in the regulatory commitment section. So the idea there is all of the information is there, but very minimal of it becomes a regulatory commitment. The control strategy, though, is part of the commitment, and we've been putting it into the justification and specification section so that we have the tie between the CQAs, the release specifications, and the rest of the control strategy around the critical parameters. I think that's worked reasonably well for us. We've obviously had a lot of discussions about that, but if that sounds particularly good or bad, I think that would be a good place to discuss.
So you're working with, if I can interpret you, and maybe put words in your mouth, you're working with the existing TTD formats.
Yes, yes.
And figuring out ways of making that work for you.
Yeah, we don't have discussions about where should we put this outside CTD or how should the CTD be changed, but to put it into CTD. I'll make another comment about Module 2. Module 2 is basically just a stripped down Module 3, and we really haven't found a good way of explaining a story like you suggested, and that if there was a way of doing that in Module 2 and having some clarification around that or some guidance as to how to provide the overall story outside of the CTD structure as of a stripped out Module 3, that would be useful.
So that's an interest. So sort of a suggestion there at the end of that about thinking about something outside of CTD. I can see another suggestion at the back there, please.
Just to I'm also Ertle Björling from a Swedish agency. I just want to have a comment about the quality overall summary. I'm not in favor of getting information in the quality overall summary that you don't get in the dossier. So sometimes you even don't read the quality overall summary, I should say.
Okay, so some differences of opinion there. Okay.
Agree.
Olvia, yes, and I'll come back to
Thank you. Well, I can agree. I have the same view because, the quality overall summary actually has no legal basis. The dossier is what you look into as assessor. So I would not favor the quality overall summary for this. Yeah, I would prefer to keep it in the dossier pharmaceutical development as we had up to now. I think that's the best, and maybe you can even change the pharmaceutical development part by putting an annex into the 3.2p2, an annex with everything summarized in the annex, and then in the dossier you can always refer to this annex. That will be all summarized in one annex. Yeah.
Nana?
Just want to make clear that I'm not suggesting that you should put new information in the quality overall summary. I'm just suggesting that you are making a summary, really a summary and the full story, because as it has already been illustrated, the details about various part of putting quality by design together is put all around in the dossier. So when you start reading the dossier, to me at least, it has been a great help that at some place, and that was in the quality overall summary, every part was put together in short, and then of course I had to go to the dossier to get the details and maybe even data, but it's a place where you can tell the full story, but not putting new information that is not to be found in the dossier. I realize that.
Peter, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment. It's good to have this discussion, but probably we should also be a bit mindful of the global dimension and not be always necessarily too selfish about our European needs. And I know we have colleagues from Japan and States here. Maybe Yoshihiro will comment a little bit about how Module 2 is used in the Japanese sense later on, but there is probably also a wider balance to be had.
Thanks for that reminder, Peter. And just for the audience, Yoshihiro, I think Matsuda, who's at the back, will give us an overview of the Japanese system later. Yoshihiro, do you want to say something briefly?
Later, I'd like to show our regulatory system about CTD. But now I can say that Module 2 is overall summary. We use this overall summary for main review document. And Module 3, there are a lot of data. So industry can show their narrative you want to say, or your control strategy, or quality risk management result as a tabular or figures. And finally, we have a unique system that is application form. So we just use application form as a regulatory bindings. So it means you can use CTD Module 2 and Module 3 as you can like to tell something.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Yoshihiro. Henrik?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I think we have chosen the approach very similar to Vertex. I think I like Nana's idea that if we can pinpoint one place where we can sort of pull up a more overview creating document, which we have tried to use in a control strategy document to really say what is the philosophy behind this and how have we developed this. And currently we put it next to the justification of specification, but a place where we can pull it up. And a follow-up on the comment from PMDA, I think this is where you also register details. If we can become clear on what is sort of under regulatory change control and what is information that we provide to ease the understanding of the product and the process, that would be great.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Christine, I think you wanted to say something.
Christine Moore from FDA. I wanted to add as well that FDA is currently exploring using a question-based review format for new drug applications. Our current generic drug applications use this format, and they enter that information in the applicant enters that information in Module 2. It's at an exploratory phase right now, and if or when we decide to move with this forward, we certainly would share that information with industry for your comments, or perhaps start a pilot. Again, it's still in the exploratory phase, but it is something that we're looking to do to increase the efficiency of and consistencies of our reviews across the different types of applications.
Thank you very much for that. Evdokia? Sure.
Christine, could you please clarify whether this question-based review would affect the CTD format?
The Module 3 would remain the same. The Module 2 would contain the questions and the applicant's answers to the questions. At least that's how they currently do it in generic drugs.
Okay, thank you. Ron?
Thank you, Graham. Ron Ogilvie from Pfizer. Some interesting topics already on the table. I was going to comment first on Peter's questions and clarifications about globalization. I don't feel that the CTD format is a problem, really. It can be made to work. But I am interested in how we can use it to get to clarity. Thinking about Keith's presentation about variations and where you put things like how you're going to manage non-critical changes, I look at some of the things that Matsuda-san and the PMDA have done in terms of differentiating commitments in their application form, differentiating how changes are managed. These are potentially very useful things. So there's some cross-learning perhaps that we can look at to improve information flow and agreements that are reached through the submission just by adding some of these little things. So I'm interested in, if I'd said to Keith in an application, and these non-critical parameters will be managed like this, would that be something that we could get as part of the review process? Just to comment very briefly on Christine's point, I think there's real value in the questions that might help an industry member position their quality by design story through a question-based review. But we have to find ways to make that globalizable. It does focus the mind, but should it immediately throw away the CTD format? And I think that's something that I know that the FDA are thinking about to try and find the value from it without causing huge tidal waves of change.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to take one last comment. Evdokia, did you want to say something? Or is there one from the floor? No? Okay. I'm conscious of the time, so let's move on. That was a good discussion, some excellent suggestions there. I'm going to ask Lina or Evdokia to now pick up the next topic, which I think is design space, and which one of you is going to... Evdokia is going to lead that, so I'll sit down and let Evdokia take over. Thank you.
During the discussion, a lot of topics came about design space, development, what needs to be in the dossier, etc., etc. But we would like to bring the discussion down to the basics. What was intriguing to say was when to apply for a design space. I mean, every time that you use a DOE, is there a need to apply for a design space and submission? Oh. Yeah.
Then you can drive the slides as well. Or I can help you.
Yeah, I can. So any immediate reactions from the floor? When you apply for a design space, what is the thinking behind it? Okay. Because sometimes this is what assessors are thinking, are questioning. Why is there a design space? What are they going to do with it?
Maybe I don't understand the question, because this is Ferdinando Spesi from Novartis. You do design space to understand the science around your process knowledge. That's it.
Mm.
Forget about the terminology. This thing is something that we should do during our development. Full stop. I don't understand the question why we shouldn't use design space.
Let me give you then some examples. Sometimes we see design spaces with such a narrow ranges that are almost normal operating ranges. And then, of course, this leads to some frustration with questions we ask, because sometimes they say, do you really need that? Sometimes we see design spaces where non-critical process parameters are included. Sometimes we see design spaces that are not supported by a control strategy that would allow changes to the process while it's operating. So you have a design space, but then the control strategy and the testing is traditional. So when we discuss about operational flexibility, what we see sometimes is that the dossier doesn't really support it. There is a design space, but something is missing.
Okay, I understand your comment. If you, from the review, you see these things, I can understand why you have this question. But in general terms, as approach is the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, John?
I want to go back to a comment that Jean-Louis made just before the break, that a company can have an enhanced development program, a quality by design development program, without requesting a design space or real-time release testing. And I think that is exactly correct. And back to Fernando's comment, I believe that every company should be pursuing an enhanced program in development because it creates a more robust process. A design space is something else. I don't think there's always a need for a design space. And I think that's what your original question was getting at, Evdokia.
Yes.
So if I could try, just very generically answer your question, the only reason to try and gel process knowledge into a design space in an application is if you're looking for relief somewhere else. And the two have to go hand in hand. If there's no relief, or if you're not looking for relief, then the design space actually does not add any value.
Yeah, this is what I was getting at. Any other reaction? Henrik?
Yeah, I think to us, we would use design space when it's not easy to describe it in parameters. And I think I gave you an example with this model earlier this morning. And I think we can easily envisage also where an safe operating area is not necessarily a square or a box. Mm-hmm. I think we saw example yesterday on the Palladium from Pfizer, where this is not easy to describe necessarily in terms of proven acceptable ranges. So there's a clear benefit from
from describing in a more advanced way.
Okay. DJ?
I just
And then
have
Dora.
a metaphor for the design space actually, because by the definition it says the multidimensional combination raw material process parameters that assures quality, and also movement within the design space does not require that you have to refile. So in my mind, I think the design space is a big square somewhere in Mediterranean, where if it is plain sunshine, you're sitting in the middle and you enjoy the sunshine, but then when it rains, you're just going to go to some corner under something protected. And I think that if instead of that square we submit a telephone booth, then there is no need to have a design space. It's just, this is where we're going to operate all the time.
DJ?
I must say I'm struggling with this question a little bit, because at the end of the day, if you do the development work and you have the same output and you're using it in a filing, what does it matter whether you call it a design space or not? At the end of the day, how you operate is the same. So to a certain extent, I would say the question is kind of redundant. I think the carrot here is the regulatory flexibility, or however, whatever you call it, right? Whatever we call it. Why can't I get it whether I call it design space or not? That's
Well, maybe what could come out of this is that a design space is not a panacea. I mean, if we want to look for operational flexibility, it needs to be coupled by something else, like a control strategy that would allow interventions and changing your process throughout. And maybe when you're applying for design space, you could think what you want to try to achieve and make it clear in a submission.
Yep.
These are topics and...
Yeah, Evdokia,
yeah.
I'd like to build on that, because I think really, and we've been trying to hammer this home back in AstraZeneca, it's Frank Montgomery here. We really have to separate development of our understanding of our process and our manufacturing process with our filing strategy and our control strategy, because what a number of people have said here, and it's really good guidance, is that once you've developed that understanding, there are decisions to be made as to how you control that process. And we've seen a number of cases where in these early submissions, we've stumbled into design space without really understanding it, without really understanding sort of what we're asking the authorities for, and without understanding the post-approval commitments that brings in a range of global environments, which is very different. And that's legislation. So it's very hard to shift, and you put authorities in difficult situations, and then we blame them for the problem, and that's wrong.
Okay, Stefan?
I absolutely agree to all the comments which were made before, but one practical reason for design space claiming QBD is really that you have what we have seen is you have less the deviations, you have less investigations, because you have a better understanding of your process. You can judge whether a deviation might have an influence on an impact on your product. So we have seen really a tremendous reduction of deviation and investigations.
Just to put the discussion in the right context, we're not questioning whether we need to use models to have a better understanding of the process, etc., process understanding. We're questioning whether a design space can alone provide on its own the operational flexibility that sometimes we're aspiring to, and sometimes we're giving you some examples of design spaces that we see, and you question. Matt? And then Lina?
Just want to follow up on that point about deviations. The way that I personally see it is that you've got two options now. You've got PARs or you've got design space, yeah? So I'm assuming that's where you're coming from. In routine manufacture, if you have PARs and you have a restriction on what you can change in a multivariate sense intentionally in terms of plan changes, so with the PAR, you make a single change, then you have to evaluate that change, then you make another change if you can evaluate that change. Deviations within registered PARs are commonly evaluated in the same way as changes, as planned changes. The process within GSK is essentially the same. And so if we don't file a design space, with our current understanding now is that we could have a very big burden during routine manufacture just through the natural variation we get within processes in terms of that amount of deviation management we'll have to do. And so that direction in terms of filing design space becomes a way that we can actually do our business and actually manufacture our batches. But I think it's been a bit unclear to us, and probably to a lot of other companies as well, how the introduction of design space and what's written in ICH about it and about PARs has led to a reinterpretation of what a PAR means and how you can do your manufacture.
I think we'll park PARs because to follow, it's a bigger discussion. Dora, and then let me try to summarize.
Actually, I think that we do forget that in the design space, somewhere there is also a model that relates the raw material to the process parameters. So, and if we look into the design space guidance that the ISP has put together, and where several companies have put their examples in there, there is a model that takes the raw material particle size, takes the process parameters, takes the magnesium stearate surface of the blending, and it tells you how you're going to do a feed-forward control to control your process if there is variability. And the definition of the design space is it is a model that applies in certain ranges. So if you have the ranges, but you don't have the model, you're not having a design space. It's simple.
Okay. Let me just say, like, a proposal is when you file for a design space, try to think how you will use it in the future. This would be it would be nice to have it clear in a submission. What is the aim of that? And this will also try to make in your development. One thing is studies and DOEs to explore ranges, and another thing is how it can be used to support operational flexibility. And this could also facilitate assessors, and this could drive also the assessment scrutiny. How will what is the design space is going to be used for? Is it just to get more knowledge? Fair enough. Or is it going to be used as to make decisions, to drive release or decisions during manufacturing? I just give the floor to Leticia and then maybe move on.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree with your last comment, and I just wanted to give my perspective as assessors and react to one comment that has been made. Someone has said that at the end of the day, whatever the way we call it, we operate in the same way. But the fact is that in the dossier, it's not always clear how it will be operated in practice. And this can be very confusing for us. For example, when we see something like smells like a design space, but at the end, the applicants say clearly, be careful, we don't claim for a design space. So we wonder why. And so it's very important for us that this is clearly, the terminology is important for us because this will put the threshold for our scrutiny in the assessment.
Lovely. So it smells like design space, but is it? And how will it be used? This will drive also assessment scrutiny. Think about that. Moving on. Can a design, we've been challenged sometimes, and this came out in the case studies, can a design space be developed only based on clinical relevance? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Based only on QTPP?
Yeah.
No. And the reason is, this is something that we discussed also yesterday when John Gospo said something about we don't need the process if we measure everything. I think if you only have the QTPP, without, you have to take into account what kind of conditions and what you put in your clinical trials. And it has to do with something that in chemical engineering call observability. And it's something that we're being taught first thing when we design processes, that you don't measure everything. Like if you have a guarantee that everything that affects the patient, you describe it with the QTPP is fine. But there may be something in there that you never thought of. There may be, there may be, for example, an alternative chemical being created if you use slightly different conditions and you didn't think of it, right? Think of them, there are so many situations we had in the past with people just increased a little bit the temperature in production, and then something else is being formed, and that has catastrophic effects. So observability is an extremely important thing, and it is understood in the chemical industry, and they say that there are other properties that we don't always measure. So what in the 10, 20 years ago, the European agency, there was another lady, I can't recall her name, but she was talking about process signatures. And this is part of it. You need the process signatures plus the quality that comes out of those process signatures in order to guarantee that what you gave your patients is the same.
Okay. Unless there are any immediate reactions, I would like to move on. But these are questions that sometimes come up, and we've been challenged.
Evdokia, if I can just add.
Oh, lovely.
Yeah, I think if you say, can a design space be solely based on clinical relevance? No. But can a design space be developed in which the main critical quality attribute that is affected and controlled is clinical relevance and dissolution performance? I think the answer can be yes, but you have to assess the potential impact on all the other critical quality attributes that could be affected.
Well, I tend to be quite provocative, but in the interest of time, we have seen in design spaces where there is no process parameter in there, because apparently this is a fantastic process, so robust, that always delivers, so it doesn't really matter. Well,
actually, thalidomide is the #1 example of why QTPP is not only applicable. That's the biggest example that they can think.
Olivia, then Lina, and then maybe it's better to try to wrap it up and move on.
Very short. I think that it's based on quality. You want to keep your quality constant. And it should be also the same as years ago when you had clinical batches coming in the application. So my answer is yes, but on the long run, it's about quality, but via quality, it's clinical relevance. So I think the answer to the question is yes.
Okay, interesting. Lina?
I want to react on this clinical relevance and what Frank have said about dissolution. There is maybe a scientific rationale behind this dissolution and clinical relevance, but to the best of my knowledge, up to now, we haven't seen any good demonstration of correlation between in vivo and in vitro. So right now, there have been many attempts to demonstrate this correlation, but since we don't have that, and I think that it's very difficult to develop and to demonstrate, I would say that the design space developed solely on clinical relevance is not something we can accept right now.
So thank you, Lina. So maybe it would be safe to say, ideally, maybe in theoretical world, it could be possible, but please bear in mind how these parameters relate and how robust is this in vitro, in vivo correlation. And in practice, we haven't seen something so far. Moving on, something very close to assessor's hearts and Lina's heart, scaling up design. Do we need commercial batches for design space development? And more important, how do we demonstrate that a parameter or a design space is scale independent? Any thoughts? We've seen design spaces developed at 200 grams and claiming a scale of 200 kilos, I think. Yes. Could this be acceptable without any commercial scale batches? What's your feeling? Ron?
Evdokia, thanks. Ron Ogilvie from Pfizer. My concern here is that we're asking very yes-no questions, and I don't think any of them are simply answered yes or no, because it depends on the understanding that the applicant presents you, and that can be case by case. Okay. So in some cases, you can build a specification and your development program based on clinical relevance for an attribute, and in some cases, you can develop a process using small-scale knowledge that you can then predict and extrapolate to large scale. There is no simple answers to these things, and if we leave the room thinking that everything has a black and whiteness about it, we will fail to reach this kind of harmonized understanding.
Thanks, Ron, for putting us back on the right track. That's true. But we have some issues when it comes to scalability. I'll give the road to Matt.
So I completely agree with Ron's point that it's obviously going to be a case-by-case basis. I think the description that's in the Q&A on, the QBD design space verification Q&A of the principle that if a process can be demonstrated to be scale independent, then you don't need to do verification at scale, I think is absolutely correct and scientifically justifiable. The only thing is, as Ron said, how much data actually is appropriate to demonstrate scale independence, because by definition you're not going to be looking at all your ranges at scale in order to do that. So I think the yes/no question is yes, you don't have to do it, or no, rather, you don't have to do everything at scale. I think that principle is scientifically correct and should be something that companies should look to follow.
Yes, John.
So, John from MSD, I'd like to echo what Ron Ogilvy said particularly. I mean, certainly from the perspective of the inference of scale, we all like to think that there's always scale liability that remains hidden. And the reality is that's not always true. But the problem is that we have to think about, as we go through development, to understand, what aspects could be scale independent and where it is. In fact, it becomes very difficult because even for a given type of chemical transformation, what may be perfectly rational and reasonable, not require scale dependent considerations in one case, may require it for another, for reasons that are very case specific. So I do agree that there's no black or white here, and we have to be prepared to discuss things that are great, or color if you're more color inclined, but with the intention of doing enough evaluation to understand what case you're specifically in.
Diana?
In my understanding, this is just relating to the issue I put forward on the model, because in the model as such, you have not yet provided argumentation why it would not be scale independent. So until you have done that, it's limited to the scale you build it on. And then it's another question if you would demonstrate that it's scale independent, for example, a factor of 10 or 100, how you're going to demonstrate that, and that whether that could be done on scientific argumentation only, whether you would initial batches and what so on, that's another discussion. But if you provide a model, you don't say anything about the scale, it means that until further evidence has been provided, it's only valid for that scale and not for a batch which has a different scale of a factor 10. And therefore it's not the yes and no, in a way it's true, until you have demonstrated that scale is not a factor. However you may do that, maybe even by a short scientific argument, it's not applicable.
I see Frank wants to respond.
Yeah, I'll take a slightly different tack on response. I suppose a lot of us stumbled into scale as one of those sort of magic objectives that we thought design space and Q8 would allow us to achieve. I think what we found was that one, we'd forgotten what the post-approval sort of regulations were around scale changes, and that in some instances they're not actually that demanding. And secondly, I'd take you back to the point you made around design space as well, Evdokia. I think some of the concerns, and we don't express ourselves well enough, is what are we going to do with that? And we had a pre-approval inspection with the FDA in Puerto Rico. And that was a concern for the inspector and also the assessor that was with them. Why were we asking for this? And we took them to the plant and we showed them the two different manufacturing lines that we were looking to move to. And we said, actually, it's because we want to move this process from here to here. The processing equipment and the train is identical. It's in the same facilities. This is why. I think as soon as the assessor and the inspector saw that, it wasn't an issue. And I think that's a really important point about going back to your point about what do we want to do with the flexibility, because we don't explain ourselves very well in our submissions.
And possibly building on that, do we understand what is the risk, where we are, what are the unknowns, and how do we plan to address them? Because not everything could be in the original file. Yes, please.
Thank you, Martijn van der Plas, Dutch agency. I think to keep this discussion clear, we should make a distinction between the scalability of routine production and the scalability of models, and the scalability of models for design space. And I think the point seems to be for the latter point, the scalability of the models, but there's some confusion with scalability of production. With regard to scalability of models, I think this is, in fact, an old item, and everyone interested in this, I would refer to the guidelines on virus validation, which were written in the 1990s, where scalability of models regarding virus validation for plasma-derived products and recombinant products was written down. And if you look to these guidances, you will see they're somewhat old. They may be a little bit patchy, but the thinking about the scalability is, I think, basically still relevant for what we are doing today. Thank you.
Pedro, quick, please.
Yeah, thanks, Pedro from Merck Serrano. We also have to think about continuous processing, because with the continuous processing scale, it's really not an issue. Once you design your design space, it's basically how long you run it. The model remains the same, and you just accumulate material on the other side. And that can be happening right now, for example, with roller compaction, when you think about it. It's a continuous process as a unit operation. And your parameters go whether you roller compact 100 kilos or whether you compact 400 kilos.
Okay. Lina, last
there
one.
was a discussion last week in IFPAC about this story, and continuous processes are not only scaled up by time, they're also scaled up by flow rate. And there is the need of a design space there, because you don't just run longer, you can just differently.
Thank you, Dora, but I have my timekeeper here who's flagging already that, we're running late. So, Lina, very
shortly.
short.
Thank you
if
for
you also
giving me the
wanted to
last
say.
word on this hot topic. So I agree with all what have been said, but I just want to say that don't ignore the scale. This is the message. I mean, if you can develop your design of experiment on whatever scale you want, but at least in the dossier you have to address the scale and tell the story to the assessor. How do you want to manage scale up of the design of experiment, of the design space, and what my colleague have said about the scalability of model is correct. Scalability of model is completely different from scalability of the process itself. So this is the final message.
Yes. Just have a plan how you'll address the residual risk. A discussion and a plan. I would like to explore still one question, like how release versus just based on compliance with design space. Do you have any thoughts there, or do you? No. No. Okay. And somebody mentioned it was also one of the questions that came from the floor. How does do changes to the specification limits might impact the design space? Do you have any experiences you would like to share with us? Dora?
Yes, actually, the product that I presented yesterday, and actually our quality inspector made also the comment that we had in the presentation that initially we had submitted for 70% and at 45 minutes, and then we were asked to go to 75% in 45 minutes. That immediately requires that you shrink the design space. And we had a different agency that reduced this even more, increased it even more. And in that case, it was a further shrinkage. So, and sometimes you may end up to have to rework your design space because you're pushed in a corner and you don't have enough flexibility.
Yeah. Ron?
Yeah, thank you. Comment on both things, I think, both of your questions, Evdokia. I think it's very clear that if you change a specification acceptance criteria and limit, it will have an impact. but we've all got to think about why that change needs to be made and if it's critical. That's one thing to really think about. We shouldn't always be driving for change just because the process looks like it can handle it. That might be the wrong approach. The second question was, is it possible to base release only on compliance with the design space? I'll be provocative too. I'd say based on what a company might know and might want to achieve, maybe anything is possible if it can be agreed with an assessor.
I would tend to agree with you. Depending what is in there, anything is possible, but how can we make it possible? In the frame of a regulation, of course, Lina corrects me. But anything could be possible. Okay, Gert.
Thank you, Gert from Roche. I think as a person who just recently moved into a regulatory and come from development, I just want to make sure that we're all grounded in some reality here. Taking this back to technical functions will be an interesting one. And I think right now, it seems to me, at least it's my experience, that companies almost managing around question of design space, around question of full-scale DOEs. There's two risks here. There's actually the risk that maybe the companies are willing to take in development to make these scale-up approaches, and they will probably be able to detect if it didn't work. But there's also then the risk of what's sometimes called the risk of approvability. So we may actually get into a situation where the companies might be doing additional experiment, not because they think it's necessary for the understanding of the product, but just because to get an approval dossier. And I think this thing with the design space limit and how the specification have changed, I think there was a very, very nice example yesterday, which I hadn't really thought about too much. And I would also say with Ron, for the first question, I mean, it seemed to be clear that it's not desirable to limit or make the design space smaller. So then the question is, why did you change the specifications? That's really the question. Is it just because you want to go tighter? And to actually, I think the example yesterday really pointed out for me for the first time how this really affects the use of maybe prior development of the design space, and that actually limits how you can benefit from your knowledge, especially when there was another follow-up comment that it's actually best to stay in that box, in that square box, and not to fill out the whole design space. So these things are actually much more connected than we maybe initially think about when we work solely on specifications.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I can see there are more people who want the floor, but we are running out of time. So just a quick summary, if I could, is when thinking about the design space, think earlier on during the development, what do you want to achieve? Where do you want to really pursue a design space? Or is it, okay, it's trendy, we have some DOEs, let's put a design space in submission. I mean, making clear how it's going to be used, it will be very helpful, and this will drive the assessment scrutiny. So clarity in what you're trying to achieve. Don't forget scale aspects and explain how this will be addressed. Yes, there are a lot of changes that can happen in the design space during the evaluation. For example, if there are changes, if the company is forced to change the specifications, this might affect the design space. So maybe some thinking earlier on might be useful. Can we achieve what did you say, Ron? Yes, anything can be achieved. There's no black and white. It's case by case. Anything can be achieved if you have a good dossier, a very scientifically based dossier, but make sure that the story is there and it's clear. So I would like to move on, and thank you for the contributions.
So we're actually going to add to the team with Dora to lead the discussion around the next topic, which we're going to pick up, which is on use of models. And I think we'll bring in Sean's point about DOEs and include that as well, if that's okay.
Okay. I have to have a disclaimer here. We had a discussion last night about the models, and at some point half an hour before everybody left, I left because I only had an hour of sleep. So I think the first thing that the model assumption and limitation to be clearly described and stated, this is not my language, but having said that, what we were discussing is that based on the ICH points to consider for modeling, there is certain classification. And yesterday, Lawrence actually did an excellent job of putting for each kind of model they used what it was. I had avoided this because I didn't want to bring extra discussion on that point. So in the ICH, it is stated that depending on the impact on the quality and on the release that these models have, so a high impact model or a high risk model is the one that is going to be the only thing you use in order to release a product. In other words, you're going to do real-time release for content, but you don't plan to measure it anything else. This is a high risk model, right? And then there are the medium and the low. So when someone is doing a model like this, for example, say, and this is also related to, is the design space, can the design space only be used for release? And I showed yesterday from our experience, no, we had to do the multivariate statistical process control. And also at Lawrence's experience from Novartis, it's the same story. You need a supervisor to tell you what is going on there. So say you do a design space model that you are going to use it for release. In there, when you did the DOE, you had certain assumptions and certain limitations. You explored the model based on certain ranges, but also you assumed certain things. So the question is, do we have to put all these details in the submission, and or do we have to keep them in a development report in the company? And then also the model maintenance plans, where do they go? And then when we develop a model like this, what are the considerations of parallel testing? Like, are we going to have, for example, a model, are we going to have an analyzer measuring something like the content is being measured by NIR, and if you have tablets that they are around 70% content, how much parallel testing do you need to do? But on the other hand, if you have a soft sensor model, like a dissolution that you based it only on a design space, and then you're going to do a supervisor thing, what is then the parallel testing that you need to do? These two are completely different concepts, so the parallel testing required is not the same. And then when you have process analytical technology, are you only use it for information only? Do you have to give information about this model? Or say you have a legacy product, and all of a sudden your people decided to put a multivariate statistical process control model for information only. Do you have to report this to anybody? And then is the monitoring used for continuous improvement? Again, that's statistical process control time. Or are you going to use it as an alternative approach to validation? So these were thoughts. They're all interrelated. So I think it's better if we hear comments on this general topic of models from the people. Sean.
Sean Jones, MHRA. I think what we can say about a model is that it's always provisional. It's never the real thing. It's always provisional. It is not going to be, it's not going to fit for eternity.
Yeah.
And that once we say that it is provisional, then we can then say, yes, it needs to be regularly checked to make sure the circumstances that when we developed it haven't changed, and so it's still valid. And I think this is, an important thing to acknowledge, really, that models are provisional, and therefore we need to recheck them on a regular basis. The other thing I want to say about modeling is, as I mentioned yesterday, when the safety model for endotoxin, is that the outcome of the model shouldn't actually lead to something which is unrealistic. It's got to be limited, not only by, we can't extrapolate outside the model, but it shouldn't create conditions where you're producing a product in unrealistic, poor GMP which you wouldn't even consider under traditional approach. QBD builds on the traditional. It doesn't kick the traditional out of the window.
Yeah.
And I think these are the things I think we need to temper. We can sometimes believe the model more than reality. And I think we need to temper. Need to make sure that's always in place.
Yeah, actually, in that case, I agree with this. And actually, sometimes we also rely on people to just do the model without having some champions from the company interrogating the results, right? And I think this is, I mean, I've seen this a lot of time, and not just here, in other companies as well, right? In other, not pharmaceuticals. You have to always have a champion that has experience in the process to interrogate, to keep asking questions, right?
Can I maybe reflect on some of the points that Dora has covered? And I think what's interesting about them is it actually touches on another aspect that we've got on the list of topics to discuss, which is the dossier quality system interaction. And it's quite clear that the categorization of models approach described in the points to consider document is actually quite a helpful way of thinking about how models are used. What's interesting, I think, is many of the topics, the way I'm reading them on here, is that there are still unanswered questions, if you like, about where should this information be held? How much of this should be included in the dossier? How much of it could be kept in the quality system or in the documentation in the company? I think that maybe is, as a general principle, that would be interesting to hear people's views around that, because I think that might help answer some of these questions. And I can see Matt and TG both want to say something. Matt was slightly ahead of TG.
Thanks. So Matt Popkin, GSK. So I think Evdokia made the point yesterday that clearly stating the categorization of the model, what it's used for in the dossier, would be very helpful for them to then carry on and review the dossier, and for them to understand why the level of detail in the dossier is commensurate with what the level's being used for. I heard that message clearly yesterday, and I thought that was really useful. And I think I think that certainly GSK is going to be looking to do that in our submissions in the future. We haven't done it in the past, and we realise how much value that will add to the reviewer to understand our submissions.
Also, in the points to consider, there is a very clear sentence there that says that the modern maintenance plans still stay with the company's quality systems, and also that usually, I mean, from our experience, we were being asked what we plan to do, and we had to submit that. TJ?
I've been waiting for the right time to say this. So I should have said this at the last discussion when someone asked what the benefits of QBD for biotech was. One of the things that we have done in our application is provide what we call the post-approval lifecycle management plan. And in this, the goal of this document is to kind of demonstrate to the regulators the robustness of a quality management systems that we have in place. So in this document, we talk about how we handle changes to CPPs within the design space, how we handle changes to non-CPPs, and what we would do if this happens and how we would kind of file it. So that's been a mechanism by which we have been able to kind of communicate what we want to do. In addition to that, another thing that we have done is we've used expanded change protocols and comparability protocols to manage changes, and that way get them pre-approved as to what you would do. Some of those would apply to a lot of these discussions that we are having, whether be it design space, be it models, be it control strategy, and I just want to throw that out there for your consideration.
Yeah, Oyvind?
If somebody has a comment to the last one, they could go before me, perhaps, but...
No, go ahead.
Sorry.
Okay, sorry. I was commenting on John's comment about when it comes to demonstrating quality, the two approaches, model predictions and testing, they are obviously different approaches, and they both have their pros and cons, and they are both estimates of the reality. So I think we could consider that a model. Well, of course, there is an amount of uncertainty there, but it is partly mitigated by the sample size, so to speak, because the small sample N testing also has its flaws. So I think this should be taken into consideration.
Yeah. Gerd?
So I just want to comment on the level of detail of the model maintenance plan in the dossier. I think many offer a different perspective or maybe experience. I think the reason why there's some reluctance of putting a lot of these details in the dossier is not because industry or experts want to be secretive about it, but it is because in the ideal case, in the case I've seen, model maintenance and overall management of these PET methods is so integrated into the site's quality system that you would actually have to outline the overall site quality system, and then the question if an assessor would have that experience. So this is much better discussed at the inspection. Granted, that's a stressful environment, and I can share my own experience with the FDA, if I may, and it's clear that if a PET method part of a dossier, you're going to spend 20% of your time in inspection on this, sometimes more. But the outcome was always that there was a very good agreement, there were no observations on this, but it is simply very difficult, although I agree with what TJ said about the palm, it's very difficult to really outline how this is managed without explaining the whole system, because ideally, and really, it should always be integrated into the normal quality system. So it's very, very difficult to do this, especially in a written communication, if you will.
Yeah.
This is really best done in discussion on site with the presence of the system. So it is not a case of secrecy or so, it is really a case of you would try to pluck this out of what's really a quality system and try to explain dossier, and that's just, I don't think that's going to be efficient.
And I think this is recognized, and that's when the points to consider, even for high-level models, still we say we keep it in the company's quality system. I just want to hear people about, to hear comments, mainly from regulators about the parallel testing story. Yes.
Thank you for pointing out this issue, because it's really an important issue, and I try to give the current regulatory position on that. So for parallel testing, the strategy needs to be proposed by the applicant and to be described in the dossier. Indeed, this parallel testing is really a good practice. It's addressing the residual risk when you run a model in the routine production. And of course, this residual risk is correlated to the impact of the model, but also to the extent of development and validation of this model. For example, the robustness of the calibration in a near model. So I think, like I see in this slide, maybe a soft sensor model may be more challenging than an analytical analyzer test model, for example, if the validation has been fully done in the submission. So there's no standard requirement on the number of batch, but it's up to the applicant to justify his approach, and keeping in mind that, of course, if he wants to achieve a reliable statistical analysis, maybe it won't reach it with only 3 batches. Now, another comment is that ideally this is already done when the submission is made, but often it's not the case. So it turns to be like a post-approval commitment in a post-approval management protocol, where the route of implementation of the model is decided and is described. Depending again on the residual risk, the assessor may want to see the data, or at least to wait for the end of this running-in period before implementation of the model. And he may want to give the marketing authorization based on the traditional testing. And once this is completed, then it may be implemented, maybe through a type of variation like do and tell. And also, if during this in-period, running-in period, some non-compliance is found, then maybe the action to be taken is an extent of the initial parallel testing proposed.
Okay. Lawrence, you want to say something?
As a PET expert working for Novartis, it's always hard because we always have to compete with the wet chemistry colleagues, and therefore we always have to prove that we are better in terms of robustness and that our models are really reliable. But one of the advantages, which was also addressed before, is actually that the biggest benefit is actually that we are increasing detectability, that our sample size is dramatically increased. And I recently also read an announcement from the FDA that they are thinking to withdraw their guidance on stratified sampling. So that means that, for instance, blend uniformity NIR is then entitled to be a standard and not something, a nice tool, which can sometimes work, that we don't always, that we consider these tools as highly mature, a highly standard, and this should be also rewarded by the industry, and they should also recommend the applicability of these tools. And I was also wondering what is actually the response from the European side to this announcement from the FDA that they are thinking that the USP 905 with 10 tablets will no longer be considered as reasonable for release purpose because it's not based on a statistical sampling plan. Are there any reactions from the European side so far?
Any reactions? Any comments?
Doesn't appear so.
Reactions?
Yeah, I think we have
Actually,
we have QWP next week, and I think we have something like this on the agenda. Yeah.
Okay.
Watch this space.
So, yeah, so the answer was that there is something is going to be discussed. Okay, any other comments for parallel testing or submission of models? Okay.
I have a question. What is your experience? Is parallel testing adequate? I was really intrigued by the presentation from GSK yesterday, where it was shown that although there was parallel testing, actually there was a failure, and you needed the support of MSPC to.
No,
to show that.
it was not okay. So what happened was that our initial proposal was that we're going to release the solution based only on design space. That was the initial proposal. In the process, we recognized that, well, in the process I came in the company, and I started looking at multivariate statistical process control on top of the design space. And we had an incident, and we noticed that this multivariate statistical process control on top of this was very useful to use. I have to say, though, that GSK was not only suggesting that we're going to release only on design space. There is a whole procedure of how you're going to follow certain other things. So you had to do a lot of univariate trending. So in the univariate trending, they would have caught the problem, right? But so the multivariate simply caught it extremely early, like 2 minutes from process data. But they would have caught the problem with the univariate trending on the densities and further down, right? So what I'm saying is only the design space is not sufficient. And if you see the presentation I made, they had a whole list of procedure, of strategy that people have to follow in order to be able to release.
Can I rephrase them a question? For soft sensor models, is parallel testing adequate, or does it need to be coupled with MSPC, with more? Do we need more to have confidence that the model during the life cycle remains?
I think that the soft sensor models require the MSPCs. This is our experience. This is the experience of Novartis, and this is the experiences also from other companies, not pharmaceutical companies.
I'd like to bring the
Lawrence
conversation
and
to discussion.
Phyllis, yeah.
What I think, and apologies, Lawrence, what I think was interesting, and maybe what we should leave people with the thought is to what Letitia said, which is it's about a dialogue and about providing scientific evidence in terms of what a company wants to do and making a proposal, and that will be assessed and some agreement will be reached and it will be approved. That seems like a very reasonable approach. I think the other thing that Lawrence said I thought was very interesting, and he talked about the comparison between the more modern model-based approaches and some of the techniques that have been described in the case studies versus the traditional. What seems to be happening here is an unwritten or unspoken assumption that traditional is somehow more robust or better. And I'm not sure that's necessarily the case. So the question is not how much parallel testing should you do, But under what circumstances is it appropriate? It may not be appropriate. It may be more appropriate just to go straight from the model-based, kind of soft sensor-based approach, because actually that's a better approach.
I don't like to extend the debate, but there's some things here that are very product specific to some particular examples, and some things that when you try and generalize are very difficult.
That's right.
So we have to be careful not to generalize. But some of these testing strategies, you're saying, is it better than end product testing, comparing one PAT release test? That's a false comparison, because actually we showed yesterday that the control strategy can be built up by also control of input quality materials. So when you look at the thing in the round, it's not whether it's better, it's whether it's good enough.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that the message is it depends on the case, and that's the thing that has to be looked at. And we should get back to the science and understanding and base our decisions on the science. If we do that, then we might end up with making the right decisions, hopefully.
I think we should let Lauren start.
Can I move the discussion on, because I know that we want to cover...
Last comment on parallel testing. I mean, this
Sure.
is actually, from a scientific point of view, it's a no-brainer to do this, but there's only a practical reason for that, because these technology is very new for the operation. It's an excellent opportunity that they can rehearse, familiarize themselves with the technology, do something with a double bottom before this is getting sharp, and then we have the problems with OOS.
Yeah.
So to anticipate any problems before we are using this modern kind of technology.
Yeah, absolutely right. So there could be all sorts of reasons why you might want to do it, and it's exactly on a case-by-case basis, and we need to base things on that basis. If I can ask Lina to come up now, and we're going to look at the next topic, which I believe is life cycle management. Okay, so let's see if we can find, there we go, slide 5.
Thank you.
Good.
This is a hot topic. I know that everybody is expecting this discussion. We have already this morning more or less started the discussion with Keith's slides, but now I think that we need to hear more from the audience. So the big question is, how can the understanding of product and process knowledge be used to support risk-based decision during product life cycle? And I think that one Pfizer representative this morning said that you would not apply for design space if you do not have any flexibility out of it. So maybe I can leave the floor to you and and ask you what are your expectations in terms of life cycle management, and can you elaborate more on what you have said this morning?
I think so. So I actually want to go back to Keith had a slide up earlier talking about the European variation guidance and overlaying a design space onto that and how it would be applied. And it was exactly our interpretation as well. So if you have an expansion of your design space, an expansion of a critical process parameter that's a component of your design space, then that would logically fall into a type 2 variation. And then if you had an expansion of a non-critical process parameter, then that could be a lower level, a type 1A, type 1B, something like that. What I would propose, or for conversation, for discussion, let's say an applicant came in with the exact same product, the exact same knowledge, simply did not present a design space, just presented their process as with parameters categorized as critical and non-critical. I would look at the variation guidance and I would actually see the exact same thing. So if I wanted to expand my critical process parameters, I could see that as a high type 2 variation. And if I wanted to expand a non-critical, I could see that as a reduced category. So when I compare and contrast those two different ways of presenting it in an application, I have the same question that we've been struggling with for the last 2 days, is what advantage does that design space give to the applicant?
Evdokia?
Well, yes, that's true. However, there is this tool that's called post-approval change management protocols, and this could be used to give this flexibility. So when you have your design space, it's not that difficult to put in a protocol together and say, based on this knowledge, if I plan to extend the range to make changes to this EPP, this is how we'll handle it. And then this could be downgraded to 1B, depending on what your proposal is and depending on what the knowledge is already in the dossier, how much experience you have with commercial scale batches, and so there is, although the classification guideline is not so flexible, it doesn't reflect doesn't accommodate qualified design submissions, we do have that window of the protocols. Do we want to have a dossier full of thousands of protocols? No, but we need to think creatively. You have your risk assessments. And then, why do we need to describe changes as this CPP is going to change? You can use the risk assessment and say changes to the high risk parameters will be dealt like this on the basis of the control strategy. We just need to be innovative and see how we can use the protocols, which is a tool that is already in the guideline, to support the flexibility that is needed using the knowledge that you have. And Christine has given some presentations in DAA about what is the view. Certain aspects we can take on board here as well. What I'm saying is there is a tool in place. We have the protocols. We just need to be imaginative in how we use them.
I can see you. I can see you. But before, Christine, would you like to respond to Evdokia before, or?
So after lunch, I'm going to give a short presentation, and some of these ideas I'll touch upon as well. And just as a preview, and I know we already talked about design space versus PARs. If a application, a dossier has some ranges in there that are very wide ranges, and they're not calling it a design space, our reviewers are instructed to figure out, to evaluate it as if it were a design space. Okay, and so so you're asking, does it matter if I call it a design space or not? For transparency purposes, if you're going to be making movements within your PARs and not just have a set, the traditional way is to have a target set point, and then to have your PARs based upon typically your equipment capability or your control capability. If you're looking for ranges wider than that, that essentially would enable you to have movements within that PAR, especially if you're not registering a target or a set point. We're going to be evaluating that as if it were a design space. For transparency purposes, I think it benefits you and is less confusion in the discussion between the reviewer and the inspector to call it a design space. We've had that scenario before where it looked like a design space, it smelled like a design space. We told the inspector and the investigator that this firm had a design space, and when they went on site, the firm said, what do you mean we don't have a design space? So there can be miscommunications and misinterpretations by creatively using different definitions for PARs, and I'd like to caution people against that.
Yes.
Yeah. David Vassler from UCB. Just following on from that. So it seems to me the real advantage of filing a design space is when you have an adaptive process. So it's not you're going from process 1.0 to 1.1 within your design space, and that's controlled by some kind of change management. It's the inputs are changing in real time, batch to batch or within the batch, and your process is adapting in real time to those variations in order to give you a consistent quality. And only through the filing of a design space can you have that flexibility.
Okay.
Yes, I think in line with this, I'm struggling a little bit, but what's the problem behind this? Because my understanding always was that the whole point of having this enhanced developmental quality by design and the design space is that you don't need to change so much to the process, and that you don't need to file variations every so often, because the process is under control and it's well developed, and it's robust, and it's therefore also robust from a regulatory perspective. So if a company is not able to make a process that's robust both from a process operating and also from a regulatory perspective, then I really wonder what the added value indeed is. Now that I have the floor, I think the issue of changes to non-CPPs was a little bit ignored in the previous round, although we discussed it yesterday. And I really think that this is in line also with what Mats Welin said an hour ago, really very important. Either we say there's a binary division between CPPs and non-CPPs, as is now outlined in ICH, and then the logical step is that everything that's in the dossier is a CPP. So, and if it's somehow part of a design space, then it automatically becomes a CPP. If this is not a tenable, useful position, then we need to go for a 3-tiered system in which you have CPPs, non-CPPs, and some in-between category in which the 2 categories of CPP and in-between are part of the dossier, and the lowest category is outside of the dossier to keep things manageable. I don't know what is the best way forward, but this is something that we have to explore.
I think that Dora would like to address your
Yeah, going first to your first comment that the design space is that if we have a design space, we prove that the process is robust and therefore we can move anywhere in the square we want. This is not what the design space is. The design space says that I have a model with which I move the process. In other words, if I operate in the middle, typically, but then I have new raw materials that they have different properties, then based on this model, I am going to change, is what the colleague over there talked about, an adaptable process. This is what the design space is. Regarding the critical and non-critical, again, when we do the design of experiments, based on the ranges that we have explored, we declare that some parameters are critical. In other words, when they move, they affect dissolution, where other ones, in the ranges that we have explored, have not affected dissolution. And yesterday, the example that I showed from GSK, in the range that we have explored, we never seen that the age of the micronized material is important. And then all of a sudden, we got an older micronized material, and we found that the age of the micronized material did play a role. So all of a sudden, something that was non-critical, not even mentioned anywhere, became very critical. So I think this is, again, related to the fact that we use empirical models. And empirical models are based on the data that we have at the time we do the model. If we don't have the data, we cannot imagine what's going to happen next. And that's why we need the observers on top of that.
But to be very blunt, I fully understand your point. But then what you do have is a process in which a certain parameter was not sufficiently investigated. So to be very blunt, neither your process nor your submission was robust. And I think that
there are about 3,000 parameters that may affect the process. Yeah. Do you think that at the time that you develop, you have all this information at your fingertips? No, and no industry has it in no part of the world. Okay, with the nuclear industry or even the airplanes you rely to fly. The other thing is, and this was also discussed very much in the IFPA conference and the ISP, is the story with the breakthrough therapies. I think people will start thinking what kind of information the design space of a breakthrough therapy is going to have at their fingertips when they start, right? So these also are going to require some flexibility for the future.
Thank you, Dora. Henrik, please.
Yeah, I have a few comments around the process parameters. I think what we have seen, and we have seen today and yesterday, how we apply the systematic approach. And when we have done that and we have submitted dossiers, what the regulators on both sides of the ocean actually like to see is some indication of consistency in the processes. So at least we experience that the step yields are requested to become parameters that we measure, that we follow up, so they now since also become critical process parameters, even though you could say the yield in itself on a process cannot be affecting the quality. But this is where it's moved from being the critical ones to also now being the process robustness indicating parameters. We also see now that, especially in Europe, you like to have the non-critical process parameters listed. We also have examples where you want limits on these non-critical process parameters. So there's a huge slide towards all of the parameters eventually becoming critical under regulatory change control. And that's why I think we need to somehow agree on how do we life cycle manage this.
Evdokia and then Leticia, and we will close the discussion.
Extremely valid point. If you have done all this work to demonstrate that it's non-critical, why should you have the same level of scrutiny? It doesn't make sense. Correct. However, as Dora said before, it has been demonstrated to be critical in those ranges. And the question from the regulator is, what if you go beyond? And of course, does it need to be a type 1B, a type 2? Possibly not, maybe not, because you already have the knowledge. And what we need from you is more a confirmation that you know that you understand that this is not critical in these ranges. And when you go beyond, you will just confirm that the non-criticality remains. So again, going back to the protocols, there's a way out. If you leave it out like that in the dossier, yes, it will fall under the normal variation category. But if this is addressed in this way with the protocol in your submission, then it can be annual reportable, because all that the regulator wants is a confirmation that you are aware of a potential residual risk and you will address it.
Last comment. Sorry?
I'd like to build on Evdokia's comment. I think there's,
shortly.
There's two very valuable points in here, Lina, and I think we need to be careful about not cutting this one down too short, because it's been such an important topic. I know. Well, we can adjust the time.
We can extend.
The 2 points. The protocols, I think, is an excellent idea. I think the issue that we've had in the past is protocols have had to be very specific and identify a particular area of a process that you are going to try and change, or at least that's my interpretation. If we are able to try to take that into a general sense, I think it could be really powerful, but we might need to help work on that to develop it. The second point I was looking at is in terms of how the European individual national agencies are organized in terms of dealing with variations. And often, in my limited experience at least, there's not an assessor that looks at the type 1As, and it tends to be a project manager. And the criteria need to be very tight. So I suppose it's a question from limited experience, but will those kind of changes that could appear to impact process pass validation and actually be able to get through?
Ron was before you. I have to give him the floor, but shortly, please, Ron.
So, Lina, I can hold mine till the control strategy piece, if that's helpful to you.
Okay.
I'm not going to get to that. I think I need to recognize the elephant in the room, because the discussion between the Dutch assessor and Dora was fascinating. And we all watched that elephant run across the room, and he's gone now. But actually, this business about where is the risk, Dora? Did you have a strong enough understanding, Dora? That's a very fair question. And to be honest with you, the difficulty is that probably the answer is no. So then every assessor in the room goes, well, I need to ask questions about everything. I need to understand even more than the company does. But no, because the bit that was missing was that Dora's control strategy was what the assessor had to challenge. So if they look at the controls and challenge the controls, you don't need to understand everything that the company doesn't understand. That's the elephant. So just wanted him to be reintroduced, really, before we missed him.
Evdokia, you want to say something? Or Leticia?
Yes, I just wanted to follow the comment from Dora, because it highlights the importance of the extent of the ranges investigated in the studies. Because sometimes at the stage of the screening design of experiments, we start with rather small ranges. So that's why it's quite frustrating, but it shows that it's important to really reflect on the design of these experiments so that we can anticipate also the reasonable, realistic ranges for process parameters.
I think we have to also be realistic. If you don't have a material that was longer than that ever, you cannot investigate it. So what I'm saying is there are unforeseen situations, and I think that rather than putting
and then
strong barriers, we should start looking at what flexibility means. And as I said, we saw it with the breakthrough therapies, where essentially people are filing past phase 2. So how much information do you have past that? So essentially, the system has to be such that when there is something unforeseen, there is a way to catch it and a way to report it. And this is what I presented yesterday. The multivariate analysis caught it, and we reported it, and then this is the procedure.
Okay, thank you. Henrik, before, and last word to you.
Yeah, I think a little bit back to the non-critical process parameters. I think we are forgetting here that all of us have a quality management system in place, and all of us are regularly being inspected. I think we are now hearing that we almost have to put all the information, all the documentation on the non-critical process parameters in the submissions. So does that mean we don't need to be inspected?
Evdokia, last word to you.
Again, everything's case by case. I mean, if I'm sure that if an assessor saw that MSPC proposal in a dossier, then this would address the concern what happens with changes to type 1S afterwards, to non-critical process parameters afterwards. So again, we have tools, we have protocols, we have scientific tools like MSPC to address the concerns of the assessors. I don't think that we are so restricted.
Okay, thank you. So I can conclude the first bullet by saying that the discussion on non-CPP is not closed yet. You have a strong invite from Evdokia to use the change management protocols and to include in them the risk assessments, the initial risk assessment as a driver for the management of the product life cycle. And also, I think that this is a message from regulator and maybe from Keith, that the categorization of variation should be in line with EU variation regulation. It cannot be done on a case-by-case by each applicant. So now I would like to jump to the second bullet, which is maybe easier. And maybe the floor is for the regulator, because the question is, how can we reduce delays to implementation of process improvements, and can collaboration between assessor and inspector improve? And how can we ensure that information is really transferred between assessor and inspectors? Just to introduce the subject, I would like to say that Europe is a complex region. We have 28 member states, and the assessor and inspectors are not in the same member state majority of the time. If we are lucky, they are in the same agency, but most of the time they are not in the same agency. So the flow of information is quite difficult to convey. So what is your opinion on that, and do you have any comment?
Just this thing you said, that the inspector and the assessor, they're not the same people. Do you not have any way of like database where a specific drug is databased and all the information goes there and all? Okay, so this is, so what do you plan to do?
We hope.
What do you plan to do in response to the database that is being created by the FDA in order to, when they take these quality metrics and the sites and this and that? I guess this is site related, but not drug related, right?
Maybe Evdokia first, and then the question from the Evdokia.
Yeah, knowledge management is an issue. Yeah, that database is maybe in a future state. Not that we don't have something at the moment. So at the moment, what we can do is rely on tracking some applications and making sure that the inspector colleagues are aware, and if they go on site, they know that this product is also manufactured there. Does it really work? I will be looking at David. I don't know.
David and Jean-Louis, would you like to say something?
There's a lot of room for improvement. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to say something. David Coburn, EMA. Well, for sure, for centralized products, the agency's in the middle, so it's much easier for the agency for centralized products to facilitate communication between assessor and inspectors. But the vast majority of products on the market are not centrally authorized, so there is a bit of a problem there, and there is also a problem with data. There isn't a database of all EU authorized products. Well, there is, but not an awful lot of information. And that probably, well, hopefully that will improve in the future, but then, then it's data maintenance and data integrity and accuracy of the database, which of course is another problem. But the question here is, how does this facilitate implementation of process improvements? And I'm struggling with that. Every company has to have a quality management system anyway, and that has to manage change, but it has to be managed within, the regulatory framework. So I'm struggling a bit as to understand how this, better interaction between assessors and inspectors can actually speed up the process. I don't know, but I'm happy if other people have ideas.
Jean-Louis, maybe? No?
Just not very much to add, just to say that we have regulatory meetings together with the assessors and industry. We meet once a year and work on common guidelines or guidelines which can infect both sides, and also in the PET team we have inspectors, so not quite sure what else we could do actually.
There is a question
Yes,
from...
this is Scott Coffey, Eli Lilly and Company. So I think this kind of topic between assessors and inspectors have been covered, actually has been touched on directly or indirectly several times. I think some of the things we struggle with is how much information do we provide to the assessor, in a dossier, than that on our quality management system, without providing the entire, everything. So that can give them enough information, at least to, to proceed on to inspection. So, there was some talk that, Frank just mentioned something about some type of general protocols or general change management protocols. Would that be some type of mechanism that we could use to describe the quality management system, knowing that that's where the general information was there that would provide the assessor, the confidence that we did have the appropriate change management system in place.
Okay, thank you. Stefan, and then Peter also want to say something. Stefan first, maybe?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. I know another Stefan in the room.
No, I can just confirm David's words that for the centralized approved products, we have the kind of reports which we have to deliver to EMA, so there should be an overview. It's a bit different for the nationally approved products. I absolutely agree. With regard to the assessment, there are, let's say, assessment teams between assessors and inspectors, but they have really distinct, let's say, different tasks. So the inspector is really focused on the GMP-related issues. It's water, it's air conditioning, it's room classification, whereas the assessors are really focused on the process and let's say, dossier-related issues. So we are looking now at in-process controls, which controls are in place on the analytical methods. So we're looking at these things. So we have realized this combination is a good combination, and we can learn on both sides, inspectors and assessors, as well as the company, I guess, due to the on-site discussions. But we have these joint inspections, and we think it's really worthwhile to do it.
Peter?
Thanks
again. It's Peter Richardson from EMA. That's an interesting sort of possible improvement at a local level, but it seemed to me always that these discussions on implementation was always more critical on a global level again. The main issues were how to implement across a number of different territories. So again, we work in our own way here, but probably I think we need to be a bit more focused on what the other benefits or downsides of the way other regions actually go about their post-approval lifecycle management. And we as regulators probably need to prioritize where our efforts are in terms of trying to, drive our energies in this regard. So the feeling I've had in the past was more to try and facilitate the growth of harmonization through other regions. And but that's the question I'm asking, is that a more important thing for us to be doing, or looking more at our assessor-inspector interaction and putting our resource efforts in that regard? So I'd be just, if anybody wanted to comment on that, that would be useful.
Maybe I have a comment from a new perspective. The audience should have also this in mind, because we are globalized companies, and And of course, you would like to file one single dossier in the 3 regions. The role of assessor and inspector in EU is quite well defined. And GMP inspectors are more on compliance, and assessors are really on the process and assessment of data and development. So in that, it makes things quite difficult. If I take the example of process validation is mostly handled by assessor and partly by inspectors, at least for the small molecule, and for the large molecule is 100% by assessor. So the role of assessor and inspector in each region should be considered also at the time of filing.
Lina, if I could chip in, as a number of these topics came up in our case study. Yeah. And your point is really well made, Peter. I think that is implementation across a global supply chain is reliant on the weakest link of that supply chain in terms of approvals. There are ways and means in terms of flavor management, and that can be done if you get alignment within major markets, and that can enable you to sort of allow those later approvals to come through. So there is value in even an ICH common perspective that we can work with, and we realize the efforts through PICs, etc. I suppose the other point that in terms of collaboration between assessors and inspectors did come up as a discussion point within our group, and maybe it's as we talk about how we can shift or downgrade some changes, or some changes may be able to be completed within the quality management system because of different regulatory approaches. The concerns with some of the inspector comments in our group was, well, how do we know that is okay and that judgment is right? And I think there's that piece that we have to get, and whether that's done through better collaboration within and across agencies or through events like this is maybe a debatable point.
Any other comment?
Yeah, I agree with Frank. I think the point raised by Peter is a very important point, to the extent where when we're manufacturing drugs in Europe and exporting them to many parts of the world, the complexity of the European system sort of to some extent gets inherited. So let's try to keep it simple, to not make that too difficult. And it's not everybody who has protocols or have fast approval times on the CMC changes. So the complexity we get here, we really push it out to the world.
It's done? Okay, last question.
It's not really a question, it's just to build on what Frank said. It's Ali Grinnell from AstraZeneca. What we're very much finding managing a global supply chain is the expectation for an increasing number of GMP desk audits. So we're not finding that the emerging health authorities have the capability to come and inspect our manufacturing sites, and they're expecting that the sort of things that inspectors see at sites that we provide to them via data, via documents. An inspector goes to a site and he can discuss with the people at that site about the process, about its capability. But doing that via a desk audit and via questions and answers is enormously difficult. So I absolutely agree with the comment over there is everything we can do in Europe to make our documentation simple, to make it transparent, and to make it available for us to then help influence other emerging markets to, if they want this sort of information, then the best way for them to obtain it is for them to come and inspect and learn from what Europe's doing, and for the reviewers and the inspectors to talk to each other.
Thanks.
Oyvind, I think your team, when you were developing these, developed the risk assessment and criticality and control strategy. Which one do you want to take first?
First one.
Let's do the first one. Okay. So, risk assessment representation. There was quite a lot of discussion about this, a number of proposals. Again, thinking about what we were trying to do this morning, which was to develop solutions and proposals for ways forwards. You can see some of the questions on the slide here, but certainly welcome contributions from the audience in terms of thinking about risk assessments? You know, do we need to provide them all over the place? Can we get away with nothing at all? Or is there some sort of guidelines about when and where and how these might be used, particularly in the submission, I think, to help tell the story? Thoughts? I'm sorry, I've just done your bit for you, audience. So, any thoughts on the risk assessment and criticality thing, or maybe, or even you want to pick up anything that that came out from your teams when you were thinking about this?
Well, I think our thinking yesterday is, we tried to summarize this on this picture. So actually, I was planning not to say too much myself, rather waiting for your comments and questions.
Well, I guess are there any great couple of comments.
Yeah,
over
just
that.
one remark. I think regarding how to present. I think we've already discussed and said that it should be comprehensive and summarize as much as possible in a clear view. There was a nice presentation of a table as an example we seen yesterday. I would suggest that we use something like that and put it in the dossier at pharmaceutical development. I think that's the best place to put it.
I think there was one comment.
Another one from Lina, I think.
All right. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's Lina from NDA. Well, I've been involved in lots of risk assessments, and one of my experience also when it comes to the submissions been that it's not always clear what we are trying to achieve. So I think if we could try to always scope the risk assessment, agree on what is the task, what are we trying to achieve, try to define upfront what do we mean by severity, probability, detectability, if there is those terms we want to use. It is not always clear what we mean by a failure mode. Is this a failure of a process parameter? Is this a failure of a CQA? And very often it happens that we muddle up things and it becomes not very clear. So I think if we could try to guide ourselves a little better when we make the risk assessment, that would be helpful, because then we can probably have a clearer message to the assessors.
Okay, I think you were first, and then
maybe two high-level reflections that may or may not fit in exactly here. First of all, I've seen many risk assessments, and often the procedures are well described and are discussed, and the face validity of these procedures is improved by, for example, more than one team, more than one procedure. But the quality of the input data of the risk assessment is not always discussed or appreciated. Well, bluntly said, garbage in, garbage out. Even if your procedure is perfect, if the assumptions and data that you're using are dubious, then your risk assessment will not produce any useful results. As a second reflection, I feel that some of the procedures tend to underestimate the importance of risks or occurrences which have a low occurrence rate but have high impact. So this then seems to result in a sort of divining away or getting out of the visibility of high impact risks, even if the occurrence is low. Whether or not this is always a problem is something to think about, but I think it's good to keep these pitfalls in mind. Thank you.
Stefan, I think, Stefan, you wanted to say something?
Stefan Rönninger from Amgen. I'm looking very careful on this discussion on risk management and risk assessments. From the point when we wrote ICHQ9, we had a long discussion what is the most important thing. And sometimes when I get asked what is risk management about, I think one thing gets forgotten, and this is saying, yeah, let's do risk assessment and we are done. And the other thing is, when you provide a risk assessment in your statement, in your filing, or in your GMP or whatever, are you really sure about the scope? Are you really sure about the risk question you want to answer? And this reflects what you said. I think we do not need more definitions and more guidance and over-regulate it and more definitions on that. I just think we should take common sense, and before we start a risk assessment, management, whatever process, think about what we want to achieve and make it so easy that when I write it down, an assessor understands it, or maybe let my colleague look if the question is right, and then we can answer. And we should always bear in mind, from the intention of also from Q9, we talked about risk as a combination of probability and severity. It's not severity only, it's not probability only. And this makes it tricky. However, then it makes an open end, because you see, 200 is good, 201 is bad as risk priority number. I get crazy when I see that, to be honest. And it's always about uncertainty, to manage uncertainty. And we try to explain it with FMEA, and I find it so great the last 2 days that one of the other regulators said, look at the fishbone diagram, or look at the risk ranking filtering method, and not always the FMEA, where you go from numbers in details and have the problems to discuss why you disclose it with 201 and 202 is not good. Just a thought.
I'd like to add a comment to that, and then Ron after. What is the purpose of presenting this in the dossier? And I think from our side, when we assess your risk assessment, it may not be necessary that we understand everything, but we should understand that you understand everything. Okay? So again, this will not be a clear guidance for you when you write your next dossier, but yes, we will never be able to criticize your number assignment, I think. This would be too detailed for us. So, but the risk assessment presentation is useful when we try and learn your story, so to speak.
Yeah. I'm Inge Terrein from Janssen Pharmaceutica. I work in the post-approval area. And as such, I do not have too much experience with the risk assessments, but what I've done so far, it is clear. It works a little bit as a tunnel. There's a lot of raw data, and it becomes more and more clear what is critical and what is then to be submitted in the file. What is not so much clear, and it looks like such an innovative new area, is that change protocol. If we have templates for that, if there's good practice to share, because that seems to be a little bit more shaded area, what we can do with that. For example, also for legacy products, if we've done the reinvestments to do a proper critical and risk assessments for even established products, is that we could apply for then flexibility from what we see now today as being relevant and maybe less relevant in all the files, and that we can really make some innovation through also for all the products. So that's my comment.
Thank you. Ron?
Honorable Pfizer. Ivan, thanks. You said an important thing, I think. You said, we cannot do your risk assessments for you. We just need to understand that you've done a good risk assessment. That's a really good comment. I want to come back to one of the things that came up yesterday. And I want to relay it to you through this models discussion that we were having this morning. And I don't know if this is a good idea, but we heard that models can be high impact, high risk, medium, low. Have we got any idea if the company's risk assessment is high impact, medium, or low? And does that come back to what you were talking about yesterday, Oyvind, in terms of it's the residual risk management piece comes back in again? So if there's a strong control strategy and a strong set of process understanding and a strong set of PATs, is the risk assessment the right place to spend our time and effort? So it's a bit rhetorical, but there might be ways to see risk assessment in a risk-managed way. Sorry.
Well, obviously, the risk management presented does support some other elements of the dossier. So this is what I meant by, well, this is what is meant, I think, by the beautiful statement in Q9, that the details presented should, what is it? Should be commensurate with the impact of the results. Other questions? Other comments? Okay, Keith, yes, go ahead, please.
Can I just respond to the question about whether there are
as a template for the protocols. To date, we've had limited experience with protocols. There isn't sort of a template, but I think it's probably something that we should look to sort of developing as something that could be used moving forward. But at the moment, there isn't anything to sort of share with you.
One more comment, Chris.
From FDA's perspective, for small molecules, we've had protocols in the regulations for a very long time, but they've mostly been used for very finite changes, such as a change of a equipment type, or typically like change of a site, etc. They've been used more extensively from the biotech perspective for many different changes that they do there. I think part of the reason it's been very finite is because the draft guidance that's been out there really says, I think it's on the first or second page, that it's meant to be a finite one. We're looking, that's not a limitation in the regulations. We're looking to expand the interpretation of what could be included in the protocols, and how that can provide you with continual support for ease of continual improvement.
Okay, thank you. Any final comments, thoughts? Okay, let's move on then to talk about the control strategy topic, which I've missed.
Yeah. I understand that the supporting slide is under models, no?
Is that right?
Yeah, there it is, models in control strategy. No.
There was a separate control strategy slide that seems to have gone missing. But,
yeah, Lina left too. She advised where the slide was.
Well, we don't need a slide. we can ask the question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on control strategy? It's one of these things that at least as I see it, and I'll start the discussion, I think there are issues around presentation of control strategy. We had a suggestion around some best practices for presentation of control strategy, which I thought were quite interesting. Some suggestions about location for control strategy in the CTD format, but maybe that's not an issue. There does seem to be an increased recognition of the value of talking about control strategy in an enhanced submission. Even David referred to it in terms of the approach that GSK are taking with their innovation on the low-dose tablet presentation that he presented. So is there more work that we need to do thinking about where and when to present, or where and how to present control strategy, or the linkage between the control strategy in the dossier and what actually happens in the manufacturing facility and that relationship to change management?
Just a comment. I don't know the thoughts about the control strategy, but one thing that is going to come soon is how do you present control strategy for continuous manufacturing? And because in there are other aspects that have to be considered, time playing a very important role. And I think this is something that we discussed with Ovid a lot, and there are teams working on it, but this is where we will need also input essentially from companies that they have done it and submitted.
Yes. Yesterday we presented from our case study a suggestion for where across the CTD would different elements of the control strategy fit. We did not discuss continuous manufacturing much these days, but do you see specific problems to that kind of manufacture which is different from the traditional batch type? Is it not possible to break down the control strategy into separate elements that would fit in separate sections?
In continuous manufacturing, you have to think of traceability, right? Because the samples are stratified, and essentially you end up with a batch at the end. You end up with an amount of material at the end, but that amount of material has come during different time periods, and a time period of 1 hour in continuous manufacturing is a lot in terms of changes that can happen in the process, right? So this traceability somehow has to be considered.
And in other words, like what came out like in the first half hour, which is at the bottom of the bucket of the batch, how do you trace it back all the way to the raw materials? And there are different ways, for example, to achieve homogeneity of incoming material. You can either pre-blend and send them in, or you can do other things. So there are different types of control strategies. All of these things have to be considered in a holistic format.
Yes. So there's definitely a need for some type of overview in a dossier, but still, one of the elements could be of the in-process control type. So yeah, so we would need to look into that. Yes, I think Nana. No, I think there was a comment there.
I'm actually going to deviate from the topic. It's related to control strategy, but it also goes to the previous topic that we discussed, which is risk assessments. I mean, at least my perception is that there are different ways to present the control strategy, and all of them are acceptable. But the thing that I guess we didn't touch on much is the key element in any submission. I think John Louis alluded to this in the opening presentation, is control strategy and the risk, how we control risk. Perhaps it'd be good to talk about where we discuss that risk and the risk assessment associated with the control strategy and how we stitch the story together. Because that's, I think, the more important piece here. I don't have any suggestions.
I was just going to ask you for that.
John.
Just to add a comment, I think the shift in focus towards a holistic control strategy is a very healthy thing. I'm actually very encouraged to see that happening. I think, personally speaking, I think we've gotten a little bit bogged down in design space and what that means, and it does seem to mean different things to different people. And design space really is one way to control a process. But when you think about a holistic control strategy, there are lots of different ways to control your process. You could use a design space. You can control it through, through simple parametric controls. It could be in-process controls, PAT. It could be traditional end product testing. And it's that kind of collection of strategies that you choose to use as an applicant, which I think is important. And that, to me, is what a holistic control strategy is. I get less concerned about where you're going to put it in the CTD. I think we can work those kinds of details out. But I think the concept and the shift in that direction towards a view of control strategy, I think, is, as I said, very healthy.
Thank you. Yes.
Lina, and then Letitia.
I would like to continue down that route about the holistic control strategy and several control strategy options. For instance, when we're developing a formula, we have a design space. We have typical several control strategy options. Like the example we saw this morning from Novo Nordisk, where they had their formula. They could either control the pH or the time. So ideally, we should be able to gain manufacturing flexibility by submitting these different control strategy options instead of just one. And of course, we have to be able to verify these, but then the applicant should be able to, within its own quality system, actually to handle which options are being used at what time. There might be different considerations, different sites, different business reason for choosing one strategy for a certain period and then move to another. And I think that will be a new future where we'll see a different kind of flexibility that we're not really using today.
Then Letitia. Mm-hmm.
Yes, just a very practical comment and to how to use the current CTD format. Personally, when I opened for the first time a dossier, I directly go to those sections which describe the process and the control of critical steps. And then the second section, specification and justification for the specifications. And usually I find there the different elements of the control strategy, and it helps me to have this holistic view of the control strategy. And then after that, when I have kept the outcome of the story, I go back to the development, and it helps me focus really on what is important and make the difference between data which our supportive information, data that are needed for compliance commitment, etc.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Other questions or comments, TG?
So I'll add to what I said earlier, and you asked me for a suggestion. My personal opinion is you could do that in a quas, because that's where you summarize what the whole dossier is all about and how you manage risk. So since we had discussions about it earlier in the morning, that's one possible area where we could use the quas.
It's an interesting suggestion. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, but that you can use the quas is not entirely true, because the quas itself is a summary of module 3. And I think what you should separate is the strategy and the surrounding development and justification, and a number of actual specific things that you do. So there's, at the end of the day, there's a specific list of controls, tests, input parameters, and these I think should be present in S22 and S24 and S4 and the analogous parts of the drug product section. So, and these are, well, I dare not say that these are regulatory commitments, but they are much closer to what many people would understand as regulatory commitments, the things that you really do and are prescriptive towards the future. Well, and for example, S26, there may be all kinds of prescriptive and historical data describing the strategy. And I don't have strong opinions on what's the ideal spot. I'm open to suggestions, but I think it's important to separate this. Thank you.
Yes, Emil? Thank you very much, Emil from the Swedish Inspectorate. I think the ideal position, now I'm maybe being a bit silly, is within your own quality management system, because that's where you start. What ends up in the dossier is what you submit, and what you work against is actually the absolutely most important document. So to maintain that document for the shelf life, not the shelf life, the life cycle of the product, is obviously very important. And as we discussed yesterday, that document is also a good idea to show to any inspectors that you are in a state of control. So I would think that you should start with your own document first. Thank you.
That's a really nice comment, Emil. And what I'm going to do is take a bit of a liberty and move on from that to the one of the other topic which we talked about, which is the dossier quality system interactions, and also the I think it's there, isn't it? Yes, the relationship in terms of the dialogue between assessors and inspectors, which has been discussed several times and is generally recognised, I think, as valuable, but may not be that easy to achieve for reasons that Lina mentioned this morning. People in different countries, this kind of thing. And so let's talk a little bit more about that relationship and how can we foster that, because we're talking about this holistic control strategy, which, as you say, it's what happens on the day-to-day basis in the factory floor that ultimately is what's most important. But which elements of that need to be presented in the dossier, and how do we actually make sure that overall the control is there? And we're used to that in some respects. If you think about the assurance of sterility, it's not the sterility test at the end. That's a almost laughable security blanket almost. It's everything else that we do, which is primarily in the GMP aspects of the way we operate the facility that really provide the assurance of sterility. So, you know, that's kind of an interesting aspect, which really I think highlights exactly the point that you're making. But I'd be interested in broader views across the audience about that interaction, both from a company perspective and from a regulator's perspective. Stefan.
Stefan Rödinger, Amgen. I very much like the statement in the QP discretion paper in the third paragraph, which says something like any comment on GMP in application is not allowed. They have very strong wording there, at least for me as not native speaker. It sounds very, very hard, which is said that it should be avoided or never brought in or something. I don't know exactly. And I think it's really good. And I tell you why. Because when you focus things like change control or deviation management in a dossier, and you change your philosophy or you change your quality system in the company, which is usually coming from a global quality system adapted to a specific site, or even if you change a site, it might change and you have a big risk of being non-compliant. For what purpose? It's micromanagement. Because if really an assessor want to know something about the quality system, they should either go to their colleagues from inspectorate, from the last inspections, or if the company provides supporting documents, existing documents like quality manuals, they see how the specific sites does implement these, for instance, change management. Just a thought, because we have to be very, very careful that we do not go in micromanagement here and get out of compliance without any rationale to the patient. Again, the second principle of Q9, level of effort and formality, consummate with level of risk.
Ron, do you want to make a comment?
Well, I'll follow Stefan because I think he's gone into the dangerous territory that I was wondering if I would go into. I think in manufacturing, you have to behave and act as if Emil and an inspector are always with you. And I think if you operate in that manner and you're thinking that the inspector is always with you, in a sense, you don't need to write anything from your quality system into the dossier. However, I think if an assessor wants me to ask about my quality systems, I think I should be prepared to provide that. So it's an interesting to and fro, I think.
David, I think your view.
Yeah, well, probably not too different from what's already been said. I mean, I like this term, the holistic control strategy, because actually what's in the dossier is probably very much related, is very much product related. And of course, when that product's introduced into a pharmaceutical factory, then it becomes part of an even more holistic control strategy. So, you know, there's an overlap between what's in the dossier and what's in the realm of GMP, and there's a kind of grey area in between. And I think when this question and answer was prepared by the IWG, they were very careful to talk about just referencing, for information, to build a bigger picture, rather than stumble accidentally into an area where you were making regulatory commitments and therefore constraining improvements of quality system, because now it's in the dossier and it's a kind of binding commitment. So it's a tricky area.
So, I mean, in a sense, what you've just said is very interesting, because this comes back to one of the issues that industry have kind of raised and has been mentioned a couple of times about what is a so-called regulatory commitment or a compliance commitment, and what is supportive information in the dossier. And again, that may be the fear of industry, is that you put this quality system information to help the assessor understand and help them make an assessment of whether to approve a design space, and all of a sudden, are you committed to what you've put in the dossier? And there is a lack of clarity, I think, and maybe there's a value in taking this conversation further after this meeting. And a dialogue between industry and regulators.
Yes, Mats?
Yeah, Mats Velin, MPA Sweden. No, I think what you bring up is very important, that it's not we are looking at something and we glue it fast, or we do an assessment and this is approved by assessor, therefore an inspector cannot come to see it. But we should also be realizing that if we would know how the company's quality system would handle any potential future monitoring and taking care of any drift and so on, that could facilitate our acceptance of things. So if we cannot put it in, that may make it more difficult for us to accept changes. So it's indeed a delicate balance here.
Yes, I think I would like to comment myself, and then Emil. I hope I misunderstood one of your points, that we do not, none of us, I think, wish for a second assessment of the quality system by the quality assessor, because that would be very unfortunate if the inspectors was there and then 6 months later the quality assessor says this is not good enough. But this is unfortunate. But as Mats said, it could be useful during assessment of a dossier if elements of the quality system can help the assessor understand the control, and that could be helpful for information, I would say. But I do not foresee that the quality assessor is reassessing the quality system.
Ferdinand, do you want to say
Well,
on this debate about the quality systems and let's say assessors, the CMC part, I would keep the two things separate.
Yeah.
If the assessor is interested to know it, we invite him to our plant. Why not? So he can see practically is there or not there. Because submitting a piece and then later becomes a commitment, that is, I don't think is the right thing to do. Or clearly that whatever is given stays out of the compliance side, because the quality systems is GMPs, is not the science and or the CMC, are two different things. At least from my standpoint, I would keep separate. Interested, fine. You come to our plant and see it.
Yes, I think it's Mats and then Gert.
Just a quick, I think it could be very clear that if this is sent in, it should be clear that this is not a part of the regulatory commitment. That could be done, I'm quite sure. Secondly, I don't think it's doable to say that, okay, if I'm lucky, there is an inspection going on, but that does not necessarily have to be by my own agency. It could be someone else. Very unlikely there will be time during an assessment we have a very limited time to have this done. So I think we should try to see how we can work without sort of limiting and making unnecessary restriction. But this information is of great help for us to understand how you as a company will handle things.
Yeah, so I think this is a good discussion, and again, probably applies here what we said in a few cases. It depends on depends on the detail of the matter, but just maybe to give some perspective, I'm aware that there are a few PET methods in operation and approved, and obviously with multivariate models, all these things that Dora and for example Lawrence described, and I know that at least for the FDA, it was acceptable. The quality system for these methods was described in about a paragraph about the size of 2/3 of a page, so not even a full page. So really, that was repeatedly acceptable level of detail. The rest obviously is subject to inspection. So I just want to, this is a number, and we said we didn't want to talk about numbers, but these are multivariate methods with model verification, the whole lot, and it was at least sufficient in that case, and a few times said about 2/3 of a page in the submission is sufficient level of detail, the rest to be inspected.